Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the office for the second part of rhetoric during the Roman period. And before we begin, I just want to make a small clarification in my lecture from yesterday, which was I think I might have sort of merged together the two definitions from the Roman theorists that we're studying instead of being more clear about that. So let me be clear about it right now. Cicero, who of course lived during the Roman Republic, he defined all persuasive speech as rhetoric. Any public speech was rhetoric. And then, of course, he gave us those 5 canons or main rules of rhetoric that must be followed and met in order to be successful in that persuasion. Quintilian, on the other hand, who we are talking about today, said that rhetoric should be defined as a good human who is speaking well. So he puts an ethic on it. He puts an extra requirement in there that you must be a good person who also knows how to speak well in order to be a good rhetorician, in order to be a rhetorician at all, really. And there's a couple of reasons why he does this, and I'm going to talk about it here today. So let's recap a little bit that we know that Cicero lived during the time of the Roman Republic, and we know that Quintilian lived during the time of the Roman Empire. What happened in between there? What do we need to know? We also know that the relationship between rhetoric and power is usually determined by the type of power structure or system that you have in place. A place or a type of government that has more distributed or decentralized power, meaning that it goes to the people, the multitude, instead of to a singular or few people, that is, which generally is reflected in democracies of various different kinds, that is when rhetoric is most necessary. So the more decentralized a system, the greater the need for the understanding of rhetoric. However, the more centralized that we have, say, for example, an authoritarian regime, such as during World War II in Germany, that we are talking about decreases the need or eliminates the need for the understanding of rhetoric almost completely. And so I explained that to you yesterday. What does that have to do with how the Roman system worked? Well, as you may know from your readings, Cicero lived during the time of the Roman Republic, and much like our democratic republic, it sort of worked the same way. There was some representation, but for the most part, they attempted to have as direct of a democracy as they could have, but due to the vast expanse of the Roman Empire, that was nearly impossible. But they were a little closer to the idea of a more direct democracy, sort of, definitely than we are. And they were sort of a little bit, but they were not nearly as close as the Greeks. So the Roman Republic was really a time for Cicero to be able to explain that if you can't tell the people, the citizens in this case, which was defined very narrowly, but if you can't tell the people what the government is doing or what the government intends or means by its language and its public presence, then the people aren't able to participate. And that means that you can't have a healthy democracy. So in order for there to be decentralized power where the people hold the power, not an individual, you must have an understanding of how rhetoric works. Now, that's a little bit questionable if you really want to get technical about it. I mean, women didn't have the right to this. Non-land owning men did not have the right to this. This was a very elite sort of job. But Cicero did believe that in order to move through the rank and file, to come up from your class, to move to the next class, you do need to be able to practice rhetoric well. That only makes sense. This is exactly what Hitler did, actually. When he was rising to power, he didn't start at the top. I mean, Hitler was not born into that. He had to work his way into the top. And the way that he did that was to be a good practitioner of rhetoric, to understand what persuasion techniques were being used and what worked best with what audiences in order to persuade others that they should follow your lead. And then, of course, he took that and ran with it in a very literal sense, okay? And so what we have happening in Rome at the time is, and remember, this is about 100 BCE roughly, going almost to year zero, which is an arbitrary signifier of the Christian Western thought of the date that Jesus was born, supposedly, which wasn't exact either, but that's beside the point. The arbitrary calendar notwithstanding, the Roman Republic really sort of had a real reliance on people like Cicero who could practice rhetoric well. And up until the point when Cicero was actually becoming more and more powerful, he was rising up in the Senate. And he started to actually become a part of the highest levels of the Senate. So sort of think of your Mitch McConnell here and your Chuck Schumer, okay? Those sort of higher up in the Senate. So people who are on the same level as everybody else in the Senate, but who garner a little bit more power for whatever reason. There were actually 4 of them, I believe at the time, that were really rising to the top. And 3 of them said, hey, we really don't need 4. I mean, maybe we could just go down to 3. And ultimately, they ended up doing that. Now, that is the boring historical story that I can tell you, that we ended up with what's known as a triumvirate ruling Rome, ultimately. But the sort of soap opera side of that story is that Cleopatra demanded that Mark Antony actually kill Cicero and bring his head on a plate. I believe it was something to that effect when I heard this sort of story, this narrative about ancient Rome that I'm not sure I buy, but it's sort of salacious and interesting. If Cleopatra really wanted to get to the power of Rome, which is what her ultimate goal was, she really wanted to move into that role and to rule Rome. She knew, get rid of Cicero. Why did she have to get rid of Cicero? Because she knew how powerful he was. Now, there's a couple of ways that could have happened, but what we do know is that ultimately Cicero ends up being murdered, essentially. We believe somewhere around either the city center or the Senate itself. His hands were cut off, his tongue was cut out, and they were nailed to the top of the Senate or to the top of the entrance to the city. We're not really sure which, but the point that they were trying to make is that his hands and his mouth were the most powerful parts of Cicero. That the reason he was able to become so popular and gain so much power was because of what he did with his hands and his mouth, which was to speak and to help others understand how to move within the government and how to move forward or progress in the government. Some argue that the day that Cicero died was the day that Rhetoric died, at least at this point. Others will say that the day that Cicero died is the day that the Republic died, which both of those sort of go hand in hand, right? It makes sense that if rhetoric dies, if the study of rhetoric and the use of it dies, then the Republic would also fall. And so what ends up happening is this series of events where we get sort of a triumvirate, and then I believe that there's sort of this debate on who's going to rule. There's a lot of backstabbing involved. There's a lot of this going on in the Senate of Rome. And ultimately, we end up with the empire. So you end up with an emperor who is ruling this. And of course, an empire is nothing if it's not sort of a centralized power, an authoritarian power, really, for the most part. And we'll get into why it's called the Holy Roman Empire next time that we talk, which will be next week. So what happened? There's a lot of possibilities for what happened, but what we do know is that around 100 CE, so we're fast forwarding almost 200 years again, like we did between Greece and Rome, we're now fast forwarding another 200 years because apparently 200 years is about the time frame for when we were preserving documents. Seriously, though, Quintilian comes around 100 CE. And for those of you who don't understand my references here, I was raised on the BC and AD scale, right? The before Christ and Anno Domini, meaning the year of our Lord. But in keeping with the fact that there are more people out there in the world who may not subscribe to the Christian or Western philosophy, for the most part, it's become more part of our general vernacular to talk about it in terms of the Common Era CE, which is now, and before the Common Era, which was BCE. So there you go. Hopefully that helps out a little bit when I make those references. So in the Common Era, in about 100, we have Quintilian. Now, Quintilian was pretty special. First of all, he was born not just rich, but very powerful. And so he had the ability to be in position of power without having to utilize rhetoric or to work his way up to that. What he did, though, was he greatly respected Cicero, the works of Cicero, and he believed Cicero was the most powerful and the best orator ever, the perfect orator, I believe he calls him, which is fascinating because, of course, it's not like he could witness Cicero speaking, but the tales that were passed down to him, the stories that were passed down, were about how amazing Cicero was. And so Quintilian dives into his books thinking, boy, I really want to study this guy and work with this guy and know this guy. And unfortunately, as you may be aware, doing that in an environment such as the Roman Empire could get you, killed. Could get your hands and your tongue nailed to the top of the Senate, because that's what they did to Cicero. So Quintilian did not want to do that, obviously. He needed to find a way to write about the same things that Cicero did, but do it in such a way that he would not be punished for it. And so this is fascinating, because remember how I said that Cicero wrote the sort of first public speaking textbook? Well, if that's the case, then what Quintilian did was he wrote the first teacher's edition, the book that helps you decode what Cicero said. And the reason that he did that was because he basically sold to the upper classes, to the ruling class, listen, I understand, we need to keep this away from the general population, but what we need to do is make sure that we teach this to your sons and daughters so that they can maintain their power, which you would think that somebody would have figured that out pretty quickly, but they didn't. Quintilian lived a very long life, and he was able to study Cicero, and he wrote this treatise called the Institute of Rhetoric. And so rhetoric as sort of a way to hold up power. So he sort of wrote about the same thing that Cicero did, but he did it a little bit differently. And it's sort of hard to tell sometimes because he does a really good job of sort of faking it out that this is not for the general commoner. This is for those who are in power and retain that power. All right. So Cicero adds a few things, as I hinted at the beginning of this. He adds a few things to Cicero's work. First of all, he does keep the 5 canons of rhetoric. He talks about them a little bit differently, though. For example, he doesn't think that rhetoric should begin, we shouldn't start teaching rhetoric to babies like Cicero did. I mean, Cicero was really like, hey, the people who are around your babies better be able to speak well, okay? The wet nurses, everybody should be able to speak well. Otherwise, your child will not be able to practice rhetoric well. And while Cicero said, hey, there's got to be a little bit of talent there too, he wasn't as tied to talent as he was to simply starting the education early. Quintilian, however, says that, you have to have some base talent in order to be able to do this, and then you can learn how to do it well. And the reason that he said that, of course, was because the only people who would have base talent in rhetoric would be people born to the upper classes. So this was one of the ways that he was able to sort of sell his ideas without, being drawn and quartered or whatever they did during the Roman Republic, or the Roman Empire, excuse me. In addition, he also says that a good rhetorician, a good orator, is a good person speaking well. He actually said a good man speaking well in the translation, but of course, as we all know, we're trying to, include other people in this than just men, as defined, however that's defined. So instead, what we do is we say sort of all humans speaking well, or any a good human speaking well. Wow. Okay, so a good human speaking well, what does that mean? Well, Aristotle said that you must have goodwill towards your audience, and your audience must understand that goodwill. That you have to be a good person, and you have to establish your credibility in your character with not just your character, the good character that you are, but also with your competence, right? Your knowledge and your ability to share that knowledge. So Quintilian comes along and says, no, listen, true, but you have to be a good person. If you're not a good person, you can't sell that you're a good person and expect everybody to, respect you. You can't just pretend like you have goodwill towards your audience. You must have goodwill towards your audience. You must be a good human being in order to start this out, which is fascinating because I don't think that Quintilian would have defined the Roman emperors as good people. Because remember, they captured power and they held on to it. They did not care who was in the way. And I don't think that Quintilian would necessarily think that they were good people. But what he did was he said to their children and their grandchildren, to his students, you have to be a good person in order to be able to do this well. And oh, look, your parents and your grandparents have done so well. They must have been really good people. So you must be good people too. And that was sort of his way of working a morality into rhetoric, or the teaching of rhetoric, or work in an ethic into it. The same way that Aristotle tried to work that ethic in by saying, listen, if you're not speaking the truth and you don't have goodwill, you're not practicing rhetoric. Quintilian sort of takes his spin on that in order to adapt it for the sort of times that he was living in and the government and the power structure that he was living in. So that will become incredibly difficult later for him, as we're going to see when we transition into the medieval period. So the differences between Cicero and Quintilian is that Cicero was during the Roman Republic, Quintilian during the Roman Empire. Cicero was able to write sort of the student handbook to public speak, or the student book textbook to public speaking. Quintilian had to write sort of the teacher's edition, the handbook that goes along with the textbook to tell you all the answers. Cicero was able to talk about rhetoric in terms of power until the end of his life. Quintilian could not do that except to say that you could utilize this to maintain the power that you have, because in order to get power during the Roman Empire, you had to pretty much be born into it. Okay? I hope that helps take those two sort of apart for you. They can be very confusing. Obviously, I confused them already today and yesterday. They can be very confusing, but it is important to understand that they had different goals for their writings, and therefore we learn different sort of tactics from them. When you read Quintilian, when you read the Institute, you're going to see that there's a bit more about the practicality of doing rhetoric, of speaking, whereas with Cicero, we get some of the sort of how to use rhetoric for the purpose of gaining power, understanding the government, sharing about the government. With Quintilian, you don't have a focus on the audience nearly as much as when you're listening or when you're reading Cicero. Cicero says the audience is important, the occasion is important. Quintilian's like, nope. But only because Quintilian was writing in that vacuum of power structure that was top-down authoritarian. Okay, so I hope that helps us understand classical Roman rhetoric and how the relationship to power is demonstrated through these two works particularly. And that's probably what's most important, because as we come out of the Roman Empire, we go to the Holy Roman Empire, which I'm not going to talk about today, but the Holy Roman Empire is sort of when the church took over. By the church, we mean the Roman Catholic Church, of course, which is what it's still known by today. and the Pope was in charge, and the Pope granted your powers to you essentially, or upheld your power and obeyed it. And it sort of went, I'm not going to say downhill there, but I'm going to say that it went a little bit differently for the next, 12 to 1800 years. Okay, so we're going to get into the Dark Ages, the medieval period, the role of the Holy Roman Empire, the fall of the Holy Roman Empire, and how that led us into sort of this age of darkness, if you will. By darkness, I mean that there wasn't a lot of progression in science. There wasn't a lot of progression in knowledge or in the division of power. Okay, we really saw a time period of sort of the feudal system and of kings and queens, and we start to get into divine right theory, and we go through the Crusades, and sort of a really interesting time. Okay, before we get to the Renaissances or the rebirth of these various areas of power. So that's where we're headed. We're heading into a time when rhetoric is not needed at all. It's important to read Quintilian to know how rhetoric might be used in an authoritarian or an empire or a power situation that's extremely centralized. Okay, hopefully that helps clarify. If there's anything else that I can think of from Quintilian and Cicero, I'll let you know. I do know that one of them, and I'm pretty sure it's Cicero, writes about 3 kinds of narratives. And if you can find that in your book, that would be something to probably highlight and read about. And I will also be talking more about that another time, particularly when we get to St. Augustine. Okay, everybody, I hope this helps, and I'll be in touch again next week.